Thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation. I will start right away. Michael Gawenda, son of Holocaust survivors from the Polish city of Łódź, explained in an interview in 2011 why immediately after their arrival to Melbourne, Australia in 1949, his parents, like many others, became active in their local Landsmanschaft, an association formed by Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, originating from the same city or county. He recalled, I quote, "For most of the Yiddish speakers, there was a sense that they were trying to recreate secular Jewishness, which was very powerful in Poland, but had been mostly destroyed by the Holocaust. It was different from the Italians and the Greeks because it was a traumatized community. There was a kind of urgency about recreating what had been destroyed. They were driven by that," quote end. His parents' voluntary involvement with the local hometown association shows, I think, not only the need for local self-organization in various aspects of life, it also shows a desperate need and desire of Shoah survivors to rescue and preserve their secular Polish-Jewish identity, as well as their language, Yiddish. Of the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust, roughly 85% spoke Yiddish. Therefore, not only did the Jews of Eastern Europe experience near annihilation, their language and culture too came close to extinction. Surviving Yiddish voices rarely entered the wider public discourse, nor the existing scholarship on the Holocaust, leading many non-Yiddish speakers to believe the language and its rich culture had ceased to exist altogether. In recent years, studies by scholars such as Jan Schwarz, Constance Paris de Baudelaire, Rachel Poyansky, or Ella Florsheim have shown that a vital yet small Yiddish literary and cultural scene existed right after the Shoah and up to the 60s and beyond, connecting a globally dispersed Jewish readership and audience. In addition, research by now has often focused on the development of early Holocaust memorialization like Yitzko books or early Holocaust scholarship. And although the cultural production and memorialization of the Shoah was predominantly conducted by Yiddish-speaking survivors from Eastern Europe, the place which Yiddish holds in all of these efforts and how and by whom the language was preserved on a community level had rarely been studied. Yet, right in the immediate aftermath of the Shoah, many Jews from various countries and backgrounds were preoccupied with the question of how the recent past would be linked to or separated from their cultural future. And having witnessed the near extinction of their civilization, many survivors felt obliged to engage in rescue efforts to preserve and reconstruct whatever they could, as we have seen in the opening example of the parents by Michael Gawenda. So for this, they would often rely on their memories of their pre-war world, which was deeply connected to the cultural pre-war memory. It was now also heavily linked to death, grief, and immense loss. And thus, surviving Jews needed to negotiate and find out among themselves in which language their memory and loss should be communicated, as language itself was and is a central aspect of any cultural identity. And while many Jews, as we know, would soon embrace Hebrew over Yiddish, the rise of Eastern European survivor Landsmannschaften in countries such as Poland, Germany, and at a later stage also Israel, North and South America, or Australia, testifies to the fact that many Jews would also commit themselves to actively keeping Yiddish alive. And using the example of survivor Landsmannschaften, I argue in this paper today that Jewish hometown associations were of key importance for the preservation and rescue of Yiddish secular culture after the Shoah. I will show that they offered a regular safe space for survivors to speak and engage with Yiddish and discuss how the associations became instrumental for Yiddish to remain an actively spoken language in the diaspora. Some quick historical background informations. So Jewish hometown associations, better known under the Yiddish name Landsmannschaften, were established by Jewish immigrants from various Eastern European countries during the height of mass migration to the United States in the 19th and 20th century. But they also existed in other countries to which Jews emigrated to, like Argentina or Palestine, Israel. And while functioning as social clubs and as a bridge between the places of origin and the new places of migration, they also provided substantial help for the newcomers. And from the early 90s up to the Second World War, hundreds of these groups existed throughout the world. However, during and after World War II, the meaning and role of Landsmannschaften shifted drastically as several hundred new ones, constituting now purely out of Holocaust survivors, flared up in Eastern Europe in places which had already been liberated by the Red Army, and later in various DP camps in Germany, Austria, and Italy. But we also find them in France or Belgium, and at later stages in the US, Latin America, or Israel. And according to the Centralne Komitee Żydowe Polsce, an estimated number of 179 Landsmannschaften were established by Jewish survivors and repatriates from the Soviet Union in Poland alone from 1944 on. And the majority of these Jews later resettled in the new Western territories of Poland, like Pomerania and Silesia, where Jewish life flourished in the years immediately after the war. Here we find one example. Yet we also find a great number of survivor circuits in cities such as Krakow or Warsaw. And after the Kielce pogrom, many Jews left Poland and moved on to Germany or other European countries where they would regroup in Landsmannschaften, split up or dissolve entirely, only to be found and refounded in another place. So although Landsmannschaften, especially those in the United States, are often described as nostalgic groups of elderly people who were longing for their past homes, romanticizing and remembering their pre-war lives in the shtetls of Eastern Europe, they were much more than that. And I think this is especially true for those Landsmannschaften which were created by survivors. Survivor Landsmannschaften would hold regular meetings where they discussed urgent matters like the distribution of material or monetary donations they had received over the collaboration with other Landsmannschaften or the Joint. They would also discuss matters concerning migration, restitution, and efforts in collecting evidence of the Nazi crimes. However, for many survivors and Jewish refugees, organizing in a hometown association meant much more than a purely administrative act necessary for receiving money or to find work. Coming together in a Landsmannschaft was first and foremost for them a social act, especially in post-war Europe in countries such as Poland or Germany, where many Yiddish-speaking survivors found themselves stranded and isolated. Landsmannschaft provided just that, a safe space where they could gather, mingle, and fulfill their social needs in an often dangerous and also unfriendly environment. And two fields in which the survivors could engage with one another on an emotional level were cultural activities as well as Holocaust memorial services. And in both, Yiddish played a crucial role, which I will show now in some brief examples. After the liberation, as I already said, many surviving Jews were isolated and alone. And thus, one of the tasks of the Landsmannschaften was to make sure that each and everyone knew that they even existed so that no one would left behind. A report from 1946 by a delegate of the American Council of Warsaw Jews, the head organization of all Warsaw Landsmannschaften in the United States, to Poland reveals, for example, that the need to organize in groups was apparently so strong that, I quote, the Jews took on communal affairs, walked around with papers, began to look for one's own landslide, wrote down their names, convened meetings, and overnight they got up with a number of organizations from Warsaw, Wilna, Wucha, and others. And here we see some announcements stemming from various Landsmannschaften in search of their landslide. Once part of a local Landsmannschaft, the individual survivor had access to direct aid and to a transnational Jewish aid network. But most of all, they became part of a group of Jews who spoke the same language, Yiddish, and who had witnessed the same horrors. At their meetings, one could exchange information about the whereabouts of family members or stories about their often traumatic experiences from the time of the war and remember and commemorate their individual and collective losses. Even though one might not have had the very same experiences during the Holocaust, they shared still the memory of having lived in the same town, surrounded by the same people, which bound them together. For example, it was common at meetings to give space to the members to talk about their experiences, and even established Landsmannschaften in the United States would react to the needs of the survivors to share their memories in Yiddish. The minutes of the Shoah Relief Society in New York, for example, reveals that every time a new survivor would come to the meetings, they would give them room to tell their stories of suffering and survival in Yiddish. So choosing Yiddish as the language for this was not an accident, it was by design. For many survivors, the language held a deeply emotional meaning. As one unknown survivor said it in a testimony after the war, I quote, "Yiddish, which I hardly knew before, the language of my parents and grandparents, has become my most sacred credo. And I swear that if there's anything I can write out of my experiences, it will be in Yiddish, the language hallowed by our millions of martyrs." So the survivors, as well as the landsmanshaftn representatives, knew that Yiddish had a near sacred meaning with the remembrance of the Shoah, and thus gave extra room in the activities for Yiddish to be spoken and heard. So many survivors also did not have a specific place to go and mourn for their dead, as almost none of them was interred in an individual grave. So the Landsmanschaftn started to hold special commemoration ceremonies or cultural events which remembered their destroyed communities, in some instances already while the Holocaust was still happening. So they would often held formal and informal commemorative events, but also on the anniversaries of the days that their local Jewish communities were destroyed. A mass shooting took place or a ghetto was dissolved and its inhabitants were deported. Likewise, other dates of significance for surviving Jews, like the Warsaw Uprising, were commemorated by many Landsmannschaften in different countries, regardless of their geographic origin. These meetings took place in various places, as we can see here, among them the sites of mass graves, local Jewish cemeteries, DP camps, former concentration camp sites, synagogues, town halls, or cultural centers around the world. So regardless of the situation of the individual Landsmannschaft, installing small memorial plaques or stones in remembrance of the victims of the Shoah at the site of the graves was a key practice to all of them. Here we see some of them. These monuments were often revealed during a yahrzeit, which marked the annual anniversary of a dead person, or in this case, of the destruction of whole communities. If survivors were not able or willing to travel back to their hometown, they would choose other places. Many Landsmannschaften in German DP camps, for example, would meet on the sites of former concentration camps and install their plaques there. Later, after migration, they would build memorials on Jewish cemeteries or in other public spaces, or they would simply gather around the plaques and take a group picture, which they could send to their fellow Landsleute in other countries. Whatever the practices, Yiddish was an integral part of them. Yiddish always appeared in written and in printed form, as we have seen on the pictures, on memorial plaques, monuments, banners, announcements, posters, and invitation cards. So the visibility of Yiddish was not only an important practical level to reach Jews from one specific hometown who were scattered around the globe, it also held a symbolical meaning, because by using and utilizing Yiddish, Jewish survivors sent a signal to the outside world that they were still alive, that there were still Jews living among them, and that they had not forgotten about their heritage. And this was especially important in post-war Europe. So the commemoration meetings, often also called Troja Academy, helped establishing also a self-aware and empowered community. They usually followed a well-structured plan, one example of which can be found in the announcement for a nationwide meeting in Lublin from 1947, which we see here. The schedule included a silent mourning march through the streets of the former ghetto, which would lead to the Jewish cemetery, where a first preliminary monument for the Lubliner victims of the Shoah, financed mostly by pre-war inhabitants of the city, was to be revealed. Later in the evening, the community of mourners would come together for a festive event, and then in the early morning hours, they would leave for a trip to Majdanek. During these events, survivors would often give speeches retelling their stories of survival as well as of their losses. Later reports from these events would be sent abroad, printed in the magazines of the various Landsmannschaften, and distributed worldwide. The speeches given at these events also often formed the basis for the countless Yitzchor books, which were compiled and distributed by Landsmannschaften all over the world in the aftermath of World War II, and which represented yet another form of Jewish Yiddish commemoration. Here we see one example. As many Jews were at first afraid to speak Yiddish after the war, the public display of Yiddish and the engagement with the language can be seen, I think, as an important act of resilience, if not even resistance. And furthermore, the active use of the language fostered its transfer also to the next generation, as during these commemoration events, Jewish children would be often included by performing Yiddish songs or other artistic acts, such as theater performances. I come to my conclusion. So while the Landsmannschaftn were not the only space in which Yiddish was preserved and reactivated after the Shoah, their work, I think, still stands out from the manifold activities we can observe elsewhere. Whereas Yiddish, for example, and the cultural activities in DP camps were set in the present and bound to a specific time and space, the idea of a Landsmannschaft migrated together with the Jewish survivors themselves and could be set in motion everywhere in the world where survivors from a specific hometown or region would like to come together. Even individuals or groups of survivors would join already established Landsmannschaften after the immigration to a specific country. They would always rejuvenate Yiddish within these groups. We know this for many testimonies. And all these efforts contributed to the preservation of Yiddish. Yet, on the other hand, the cultural activities and the commemoration efforts mentioned above would not have been possible without Yiddish itself, because Yiddish was still the lingua franca of the Eastern European Jews. And only through Yiddish, these practices of remembering could take on a universal form that echoed throughout the diaspora. So even as the practical use of the language declined in the decades to come and was increasingly limited to selected communities, I think that today's revival of Yiddish secular culture in cities such as New York or Berlin would not have been conceivable without the efforts of the Shoah generation in the immediate post-war period. They preserved the memory and the legacy of Yiddish as a community language, but also the idea of Yiddishkeit and the mental geography of the lost Yiddish land. And through their commitment and self-confident actions, they rescued Yiddish from its designated downfall and thus prevented the linguicide in the face of a genocide. Thank you.